Howdy folks, and welcome to this video on Bootstrap Basics. In this video, I'll introduce you to Bootstrap and let you know what it is and how it works and how we can use class names in our HTML to style our pages. And then I'll get into my favorite aspect of Bootstrap, which is its rows and columns layout functionality, which allow you to create responsive layouts really easily. All right, let's jump into it. Okay, so first off, what is Bootstrap? Bootstrap is a CSS framework that we incorporate into our projects that allows us to style our HTML simply by adding class names to our elements. Basically, we incorporate a very large CSS file that Bootstrap made that has lots and lots of class selectors in it, and we utilize those class selectors simply by adding those corresponding class names to our elements to achieve specific styling. The class names follow a convention, a pattern, so that it's easy to remember what they do and how they work. So let's get started on incorporating Bootstrap into our project. So here I have an HTML file with nothing going on yet. In order to use Bootstrap, the easiest way is to connect to a CDN network using a link tag. CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. So we can use a link tag to connect to a remote CSS file, the Bootstrap CSS file. And then after that, we're ready to start using it. So let's look at the Bootstrap website. So if you were to go to Google and type in Bootstrap, their website would be the first thing that pops up. And if you head to read the docs, you get this nice quick start guide. They show you to start with an HTML file. We've done that already. And then they show you how to add the link tag. Now also, Bootstrap does offer JavaScript functionality. We won't get into that in this video, but that is a very great feature that Bootstrap offers. But for now, we'll just focus on their CSS framework. And so to connect to that, we would just grab the link tag that they offer us, which connects to the CDN and allows us to connect to the CSS file. So I'm just going to copy that and put it into the head tag of my HTML page. And as you can see, it is a CSS file. It's a minified CSS file, but we don't need to read it. We just need it to work. So just by doing that, we're ready to start utilizing Bootstrap. I also want to point out that on the website, there are all these great examples that you can just grab and use in your projects. You can grab forms. You can just scroll through and look for various examples. Say you want a form that looks like this. You would just grab the code and copy it straight into your HTML and it would look exactly like that. It's pretty awesome. You got all these components, accordions, alert, badges, cards, carousels, very, very useful stuff. We're not going to do any of that copying and pasting in this video, but I definitely recommend playing around with that. It's also a great way to get familiar with the class names. So to get familiar with the class names that Bootstrap has does require a little bit of learning and a little bit of memorization, but you'll find that those class names do follow intuitive patterns and are actually not that hard to learn. I'm not going to take you through all the styling class names that Bootstrap has to offer in this video, but a brief example, let's say for the body, I wanted to add a background color. I would add a class bg dash and then specify a background color. Bootstrap offers these specific colors that have these names like danger, dark, primary, etc. And if I wanted to add the primary color for my background, I would just have a class name bg-primary. The dashes are a convention that Bootstrap uses to separate properties and values. If, for example, I wanted to add some padding to the main tag here, I would just say p and then give it a value between 1 and 5. If I wanted a lot, I would go with 5. And it auto-completed here pt5, which is short for padding top. So padding all around would be p-5, and padding top would be pt5. There are a couple of classes that I think it's worth mentioning in this video, which are container and container fluid. So let's have a look here. I have this yellow paragraph on my page here. And what's going on here is the main container is a container. I gave it a class of container. That class gives you some space on the left and right, and it also enforces a maximum width for your content. If I shrink the screen, you see there's always a little bit of space on the left and right. And as I get really wide, eventually the content reaches a max width. And let's actually look at the code for that. If I were to make that class a container fluid, you would see now the content actually stretches all the way from side to side, no matter how wide I make the screen. And that's what a container fluid class looks like, which is good for nav bars and footers and such. And maybe for the content of your body, you'd want to use container instead. Okay, so now I want to jump into Bootstrap's layout functionality. In Bootstrap's layout system, they use a 12-column system. So you can style your width dynamically by giving it a number of columns that you want your element to span. By default, a div, for example, will span 12 columns, and that's what this div is doing here. This is spanning all of its width that's available to it, and it is thus spanning 12 columns. Here is an example of two elements that span 6 columns, i.e. half of the available width. And to do that, here's the code for that example. Those elements have the class call-6, specifying that you want those divs to span half of their available width. And so here's an example of 4 elements that each span 3 columns, i.e. 1/4 of the available width. And let's have a look at that example. You can see each of those 4 elements have the class call-3, specifying that we want them to span 3 columns each. So now you're starting to see that we can use this 12-column system to break apart our width, our available width. In order to make this column system work, however, you need to group things into rows. This, for example, is one row. When you group something into a row by giving it a class of row, you're saying, I want these elements to line horizontally, inline, and then I can start using the column classes to give them widths that are proportionate to the width of that row. So in this example, I have a div that has a class name row, and then within it, I have my 4 elements that span 3 columns each. And so now if I were to change the last one to 6 columns, it doesn't have room anymore because the columns add up to more than 12. And so it wraps it down below the first 3 and gives you this result. Okay, so here's what's really cool about this column system. You can specify breakpoints and have the width change based off of the screen size. So let's go back to this example here. So here we are looking at our example where we had 2 elements that each span 6 columns. Let's say, though, we want them to span 12 columns at narrower screens. Well, when you are thinking about these breakpoints with Bootstrap, you want to think about styling the small sizes first and then specifying what changes happen as you hit certain breakpoints in screen size as you get wider and wider. It's very easy to specify the breakpoints in Bootstrap because they give you these class names for medium screens, small screens, large screens, etc. I'll show you how to do that. So if I were to remove these entirely, they would default to 12 columns. But I want to specify that when we get to the medium screen size, I want them to switch to 6. And here's how we do that. So we can leave out the small screen styling because that's the way we like it. It's at the default. But now I'll say call-md for medium 6. You're saying at medium screen sizes, I want these to be 6 columns wide, and we will do the same thing for the other one. Call MD 6. So the screen size breakpoint goes right there in the middle. And there you have it. Right there at the medium-sized screen breakpoint, it changes. If you were to make this SM for the small size, you would see it doesn't change until we finally hit that smaller screen size. And maybe that's the way you want to do it. So now you're seeing some dynamic responsive layouts. That's pretty cool. So what if you had sort of a more complicated example, something that looked like this? How would you do this? Okay, you're looking at this and you're seeing everything is in one column. Okay, that's sort of straightforward. But then as we get a little wider, oh, those split into two, kind of like we just did. And then we get a little wider. Oh, and those split into 4. Okay, that's, you know, those are changing to 3 columns at what looks like the medium screen width. And then as we get towards the large, ooh, something interesting happens. This yellow one is now up here. So what that tells me is that this must be a container and row in and of itself. And that is more easily seen when we expand past the large screen breakpoint. And now it's quite easy to see that the green and the yellow are grouped together in one row. Each of these greens still represents 3 columns, adding up to 12, but that's in the context of this container that takes up 8 of its available columns. This yellow one here still takes up 12 of its available columns, but that's in the context of this row, which takes up 4 of its available columns. And thus, we have this one grander row, which is separated into 8 columns and 4 columns as such. So let's have a little look at the code here. So here's our main container with a little padding on the top. And we've labeled this div here as the container for green and yellow. Okay, and as you can see, it is all one row. And now you have the container for the 4 greens, and it is also a row. And so in that row, you have each of the greens that shrink down to 3 once we get past the medium screen breakpoint. But the key here is that the greens themselves as a group shrink down to 8 columns once we pass the large screen breakpoint. And then at that same breakpoint, the yellow one shrinks down to 4, giving it room to be up alongside the greens here. So what this demonstrates is the ability to have rows within rows, and thus you're no longer limited to the overall 12 columns of the main container. You can now have 12 columns of a row within a row and more finely slice and dice your layout if you are so inclined. One key thing to remember is that it is a good idea to use the container with a row nested inside of it. The Bootstrap layout system works better that way. If you apply the row class and add columns, and you're not inside a container, it'll still work, but it is much more predictable and clean if you follow this structure. So there you have it. You've seen the ability to make a dynamic layout with Bootstrap. I encourage you to get started with Bootstrap by following their examples, copying and pasting some of their components, and learning their class names, because this video merely scratches the surface of what Bootstrap can do. It can do quite a lot, especially if you incorporate the JavaScript and utilize some of its more dynamic components. I hope this gets you excited about Bootstrap, and I hope that you enjoy using it for your projects. Alrighty folks, happy coding. Take care.